December 20th, 1943. The time is approximately 12:30 p.m. The location is the frozen airspace over northern Germany near the border of the North Sea. Below, the city of Bremen is a pall of smoke, the target of a massive American bombing raid. But for the crew of the B-17 Flying Fortress Ye Olde Pub, the mission is over. Survival is the only objective now. The cold is a physical enemy, a brutal -60 degrees Celsius at their initial bombing altitude of 27,300 feet. 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, on his very first mission as an aircraft commander, fights the controls of his shattered bomber. The roaring symphony of 4 Wright Cyclone engines has been replaced by a discordant prayer. The number 2 engine is dead. Number 4 is failing. The plexiglass nose has been blown out, exposing the bombardier to the merciless, freezing wind. Ye Olde Pub is a flying wreck. Flak has ripped through its skin, severing hydraulic and electrical systems. For over 10 minutes, a swarm of German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s of Jagdgeschwader 11, had descended upon them, riddling the fuselage with cannon and machine gun fire. The bomber has lost half of its rudder and its port-side elevator. Inside, the scene is one of controlled chaos. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, is dead. 6 other members of the 10-man crew are wounded, some severely. The bomber's own defenses are crippled. Of its 11 machine guns, only a precious few are still operational. Their intercom is out. They are utterly, terrifyingly alone. They have fallen out of the protective formation of the 379th Bombardment Group, stragglers in a sky that belongs to the enemy. Every law of aerial combat dictates their fate. A crippled bomber, isolated and wounded, is not a challenge. It is a target, a statistic waiting to happen. On the ground, at a Luftwaffe airfield, a German pilot has just finished refueling and rearming his Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6. His name is Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, a seasoned ace of Jagdgeschwader 27. He has already shot down 2 B-17s this day. One more, and he will earn the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. The sighting of a lone, limping bomber is a gift. The kill is a certainty. The standing order from the Luftwaffe High Command is unequivocal, a directive born from the desperation of a nation being bombed into submission. It echoes in the mind of every pilot who takes to the sky. All enemy aircraft are to be destroyed without exception. No quarter will be given. Failure to engage is a dereliction of duty punishable by court-martial. For a pilot in the defense of the Reich, mercy is not an option. It is treason. Stiegler takes off, his powerful Daimler-Benz engine clawing for altitude. He quickly closes the distance to the crippled fortress. His thumb moves to the gun switch. He has the bomber perfectly framed in his sights. He sees the shattered tail, the gaping holes in the fuselage, the dead engine. He is about to press the trigger to send over 20,000 pounds of American aluminum and its crew plummeting into the frozen German landscape. But then he sees something else. Through the torn open waist of the bomber, he can see men. He sees the crew, frantic, working to save their wounded comrades. He sees not a machine of war, but a coffin full of dying men. And in that instant, a different order takes precedence, a code instilled in him long before. Franz Stiegler's thumb moves away from the gun switch. He does not fire. Instead, he makes a quiet, determined decision, an act of shocking defiance that will place his own life in the hands of the very men he was sent to kill. He will not destroy the B-17. He will save it.
To understand the extraordinary decision made by Franz Stiegler, one must understand the man himself. He was not a product of the Nazi Party's fanatical ideology. He was a product of a different, older Germany. Born in Bavaria in 1915, Stiegler's world was shaped not by politics, but by flight. His father had been a pilot and observer in the Great War, and the pull of the sky was in his blood. By the age of 12, he was flying gliders, feeling the wind currents, learning the silent language of the air. Before the war, he was a civilian airline pilot for Deutsche Lufthansa, the forerunner to Lufthansa. His life was one of schedules and flight paths, of delivering passengers, not ordnance. The cockpit was his office, a place of precision and calm. This background instilled in him a deep respect for the machinery of flight and for those who piloted it. He was a professional aviator first, a soldier second. He had only become a fighter pilot to avenge the death of his older brother August, who was killed in a flying accident early in the war. It was a personal vendetta, not a political crusade, that placed him in the cockpit of a Bf-109. But it was a specific lesson from a specific mentor that cemented his moral compass. His commanding officer in North Africa, a man named Gustav Rodel of the famed Jagdgeschwader 27, had issued a stern and unforgettable warning to his young pilots. Rodel had told them, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." It was a declaration that established a clear line between combat and murder. "You follow the rules for you, not for the enemy," Rodel insisted. "You fight by the rules to keep your humanity." This was the core of the unspoken code of honor that many veteran pilots on both sides held to. For Stigler, looking at the helpless crew of Ye Olde Pub, they were no longer combatants. They were, in his own words, in a parachute. To shoot them down would not be an act of war, it would be an execution. The strategic nightmare for Charlie Brown and his crew began hours earlier. The target, a Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft production facility in Bremen, was a critical component of the German war machine. But it was also one of the most heavily defended targets in the Third Reich. The pre-mission briefing for the men of the 527th Bombardment Squadron had been grim. They were warned to expect hundreds of enemy fighters and a city ringed by over 250 heavy flak guns. Brown's crew was assigned to fly Purple Heart Corner, a position on the edge of the bomber formation that was notoriously vulnerable to attack. The name was a dark piece of gallows humor. It was the position where crews were most likely to be hit. The mission was Charlie Brown's first in command, and the pressure was immense. At only 21, he had the lives of 9 other men in his hands. The crew of Ye Olde Pub was a cross-section of America. There was the co-pilot, Spencer Pinky Luke, the navigator, Al Sadak, and the bombardier, Robert Andrews. In the back, manning the guns, were men like Bertrand Frenchy Colomb and the tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode, who would not survive the mission. They were young, barely out of their teens, thrust into a brutal war of attrition thousands of feet above a foreign continent. The official plan had already failed them. The 10-minute bomb run over Bremen was a descent into hell. The sky erupted in puffs of black smoke as the 88mm flat cannons opened fire. A shell burst shattered their plexiglass nose, knocking out the number 2 engine and damaging number 4. Almost immediately, they began to lose speed and altitude, falling behind the main bomber stream. That was when the fighters came. Like sharks sensing blood in the water, a dozen German planes from GG-11 swarmed the lone struggling bomber. For 10 agonizing minutes, cannon shells and machine gun bullets tore through the unarmored sections of the B-17. The oxygen system was hit, causing Brown to briefly lose consciousness. When he came to, the plane was in a steep dive, plummeting towards the earth. He wrestled with the controls, pulling the bomber out of the dive just a few thousand feet above the ground. He was now flying blind, his compass damaged, disoriented, and deep inside enemy territory. The situation was beyond dire. It was hopeless. The official plan, the mutual defense of the bomber box formation, had vanished with the rest of their squadron. There was no protocol for this. There was no one coming to save them. As Brown scanned the sky, praying for a miracle, he saw it. A single, gray Bf-109 parked on his right wingtip, so close he could see the pilot in the cockpit. The final nightmare had arrived.
Franz Stigler held his position, flying in perfect, unnerving formation just off the B-17's wing. Inside the bomber, what little hope remained evaporated. Charlie Brown and his co-pilot stared in disbelief at the German fighter. Every instinct screamed that this was the end. The German pilot was toying with them, choosing his moment, savoring the kill. Brown ordered his dorsal turret gunner to aim his twin 50-caliber machine guns directly at the Messerschmitt's cockpit, a final, desperate act of defiance, but to hold his fire. It was in this protracted, silent standoff that Stiegler's aha moment occurred. He wasn't just observing a damaged aircraft, he was reading a story. The silent, unmoving tail guns told him the gunner was dead or incapacitated. The visible chaos and the frantic, almost pleading eyes of the American pilot he could now see told him the crew was at its breaking point. But the most critical detail he observed was the bomber's heading. With a damaged compass and no navigator in a position to give clear instructions, the B-17 was flying deeper into Germany, not toward the relative safety of the North Sea. They were lost. Their flight path was taking them directly towards more flak batteries and fighter bases. His act of mercy would be meaningless if they were simply shot down by someone else minutes later. He had to do more than spare them. He had to guide them. This was the genesis of his brilliant and fantastically dangerous plan. He couldn't use his radio. The transmission would be intercepted and he would be condemned as a traitor. He had to communicate through the universal, unspoken language of pilots. He pulled his fighter even closer, making eye contact with Charlie Brown across the few feet of empty space that separated them. He used hand signals pointing down, trying to indicate they should land at a German airfield. For Stiegler, this was the most logical solution. They would become prisoners of war, but they would be alive. But Charlie Brown, bewildered and deeply suspicious, shook his head. Landing was not an option. He didn't understand Stiegler's intent. Was it a trap? A trick? He held his course. Stiegler now faced a second, more profound choice. His initial attempt at communication had failed. He could break away, leave them to their fate, and claim he never saw them. It would be the safe, sensible thing to do. But the image of the wounded crew, of the humanity inside that broken machine, would not release him. He had to see it through. He conceived of a second, even more audacious plan. If they would not land, he would have to escort them. The execution was an act of supreme airmanship and almost suicidal bravery. Stiegler shifted his Bf-109 from the B-17's right wing to its left, positioning himself in a tight formation. This was not a random maneuver. He was using his own aircraft as a shield. From the ground, German flak batteries would see the unmistakable silhouette of a Messerschmitt flying in close escort formation. Standard Luftwaffe protocol dictated that gunners on the ground should not fire on a plane being escorted by a German fighter, as it was assumed the enemy aircraft was being guided to a surrender airfield or was a captured plane being tested. Stiegler was using the rigid German military protocol against itself. He was transforming his fighter from a weapon of destruction to a symbol of protection, a forbidden tool in the most profound sense. He was banking on the gunners below to follow their training without question.
From the enemy's perspective on the ground, the sight was utterly confounding. An American B-17, a hated symbol of the devastating air raids, flying calmly over German territory with a Luftwaffe fighter tucked neatly on its wing. It made no tactical sense. The flak gunners would have been alerted to the lone bomber, their guns aimed and ready. But the presence of the Bf-109 would have created immediate hesitation and confusion. Was it an escort? Had the bomber surrendered? Was it a special mission? In the critical seconds of indecision, the two planes would pass safely overhead. The flawed response of the ground crews, born from a rigid adherence to procedure, was the key to Stigler's success. He had effectively created a ghost escort, a psychological shield that was more effective than any armor. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew could only watch in stunned silence. The German pilot, who they believed was their executioner, had become their guardian angel. The terrifying proximity of the fighter was now a strange form of comfort. Charlie Brown, still not fully comprehending the Germans' motive, maintained his course towards the coast. Stigler, realizing Brown was still disoriented, pointed his plane towards the North Sea, trying to show him the way home. He then made another gesture, pointing towards the distant horizon and then specifically towards Sweden. As a neutral country, landing in Sweden would mean the crew would be interned for the rest of the war, but they would be safe. It was a far better option than a risky flight across 250 miles of storm-tossed North Sea in a barely flyable aircraft. But the message was lost in translation. Brown, his focus narrowed to the singular goal of reaching his home base in England, continued flying west. For what felt like an eternity, the bizarre procession continued. The crippled American giant and its German shadow flew together through the most heavily defended airspace in the world. They passed over the final coastal flak batteries. Stigler's gamble had paid off. They had made it. They were now over the open water of the North Sea. His job was done. He could do no more. To fly further would risk running out of fuel and being shot down by Allied fighters. He pulled his Bf-109 alongside the cockpit of Ye Olde Pub one last time. He looked across the void at Charlie Brown, the young American pilot whose life he held in his hands. He raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. Then he peeled his fighter away and turned back towards Germany. Back towards a war that demanded his ruthlessness, having just committed an act of profound humanity. The tide had turned, not with a barrage of bullets, but with a gesture of respect. For Charlie Brown and the surviving members of his crew, it was nothing short of a miracle. Against all odds, they nursed their battered aircraft across the water, finally landing at RAF Seething, the home of the 448th Bomb Group. The legend of the German ace, who saluted rather than shot, was born in that moment, a secret held tight by a handful of men for decades to come. There is no known captured debriefing from a German gunner that day, no enemy quote to validate the ghost force. The proof was simpler, the impossible survival of Ye Olde Pub and her crew. The fact they made it home at all was the only validation needed.
As Ye Olde Pub touched down at RAF Seething, its ravaged state was a spectacle. The ground crew stared in awe at the plane, which looked more like a sieve than a flying machine. It was, as one observer later noted, the most heavily damaged aircraft to ever return from a mission. The first verdict on Franz Stigler's actions came not from a superior officer, but from the very men he saved. As the wounded were carefully removed from the aircraft, the story of the strange encounter spread among the crew. They owed their lives not just to Charlie Brown's skillful flying, but to the inexplicable mercy of an enemy pilot. The thanks were unspoken, a shared look of disbelief and profound gratitude for the German ace who had appeared as an angel on their wing. Back in Germany, however, Franz Stigler was facing a far more perilous debriefing. He landed back at his airfield, his mind racing. He knew the consequences of his actions. If the truth were discovered, it would mean a court-martial, and likely a firing squad. His commanding officer would have demanded a report. Why had he not engaged the lone bomber? Where was the gun camera footage of the kill that would have secured his Knight's Cross? Stigler was a man of honor, but he was not a fool.
His defense could not be the truth. It had to be a lie that fit within the accepted narratives of aerial combat. When confronted, he simply stated that he had engaged the enemy aircraft over the sea and that it had gone down into the water. In the chaos of an air battle, with planes falling from the sky across hundreds of square miles, it was a plausible and unverifiable claim. His word, as a decorated ace, was enough. He never told a soul what he had truly done. He sacrificed the Knight's Cross to save his own life and to preserve the sanctity of his decision. The secret was his alone. For Charlie Brown, the debriefing was equally tense, though for different reasons. He and his crew were taken before intelligence officers and recounted the entire mission in meticulous detail, including the bizarre escort by the German fighter. The initial reaction from his superiors was disbelief, followed by a swift and decisive order. The crew was to tell no one about this incident. The information was immediately classified. The reasoning from high command was cold and pragmatic. They could not have American bomber crews heading into enemy territory with the hope that some German pilots might show them mercy. War required a clear and unambiguous enemy. The story of the chivalrous German ace complicated that narrative. It introduced a shade of gray into a black and white conflict. And so, for the sake of morale and military discipline, the story was buried. Charlie Brown was ordered to complete his combat tour, and he did, flying 27 more missions. Ye Olde Pub, however, was too badly damaged to ever fly in combat again. It was eventually returned to the United States and scrapped in August of 1945. There was no formal punishment for Brown, as he had broken no rules. But there was no official vindication either. The grudge, if there was one, was against the story itself. The irrefutable logic that saved both men was the shared secrecy of their encounter. Stigler's life depended on his silence. Brown's military career and the psychological simplicity of the war effort depended on his. The unsung reward for Charlie Brown and his crew was life itself. For their harrowing mission and their heroism in bringing the battered plane home, the crew members received the Silver Star, and Brown was eventually awarded the Air Force Cross, the second highest award for valor. But these medals were for the fight, not for the moment of peace. The true reward was far more personal. It was the quiet knowledge that in the darkest moment they had been touched by an act of grace. The shared secret of that day became a quiet, invisible bond between two men on opposite sides of a brutal war, a ripple of humanity that would continue to spread, unseen, for decades.
An act of individual defiance on the battlefield is often just that, a single, isolated event. But the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown is different. While Stigler's actions were a direct contradiction of his orders, the code he followed was not his alone. It was part of an unwritten but deeply felt tradition of chivalry among many veteran fighter pilots, a belief that there was a line between being a soldier and a murderer. The Luftwaffe itself, in its early doctrine, officially rejected terror bombing as counterproductive, focusing instead on military targets. Stigler's decision can be seen as a personal application of this principle. He saw the B-17 as no longer a military target, but as a vessel of helpless men. His tactic of using his own fighter as a shield, while improvised, was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. It exploited the enemy's own procedures to achieve an impossible outcome. While it never became official doctrine, one cannot order a pilot to risk treason. The story, once it became public decades after the war, was studied in military academies. It became a powerful case study in situational ethics and the concept of a higher call to one's own conscience, even in the face of direct orders. It serves as a lesson in what military strategists now refer to as cognitive friction, using an enemy's expectations and rigid procedures to create confusion and paralysis. For over 40 years, the story remained a secret, a ghost in the memories of the men who lived it. Charlie Brown, who returned to the Air Force after the war and served in military intelligence until 1965, was haunted by the memory. He had nightmares not of the flak or the fighters, but of the silent, gray Messerschmitt on his wing. He needed to know who the pilot was and why he had done what he had done. In 1986, at a reunion of combat pilots called The Gathering of the Eagles, he finally told his story publicly. The response was electric, though tinged with skepticism. This began a new mission for Charlie Brown. He spent years searching through American and German archives, trying to find the pilot who had saved him. Finally, in 1990, he placed an ad in a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots, recounting the story and asking if anyone knew the pilot involved. Months later, a letter arrived from Canada. It began simply, "I was the one." Franz Stiegler had moved to Vancouver in 1953 and become a successful businessman. He had never spoken of the incident. When he saw Brown's ad, he knew it was time. On the phone, he described the damage to the B-17, the hand signals, the salute, details only the two pilots could have known. Their reunion was more than a meeting. It was a reconciliation. The two men, once sworn enemies, became the closest of friends, like brothers, as Stiegler would say. They traveled across North America, telling their story to captivated audiences, their message a simple one. Enemies are better off as friends. Their bond was a testament to the power of a single decision to transcend the hatred of war. After the war, both men returned to quiet, civilian lives, a stark contrast to the life-and-death drama they had shared in the skies over Germany. Brown became an inventor after his government service, and Stiegler started a business in Canada. They were ordinary men who had been part of an extraordinary moment. In a late-life interview, Franz Stiegler, reflecting on his decision, put his reasoning into its starkest, most powerful terms. "To shoot you down," he told Charlie, "would have been dishonorable." Later, he wrote in a book he gave to Charlie, a final word that brought the story full circle, connecting his act of mercy to his own personal loss. In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December 1943, 4 days before Christmas, I had the chance to save a B-17 from its destruction, a plane with a wounded crew. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Franz Stiegler and Charlie Brown died within months of each other in 2008, their friendship lasting until the very end. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single act of conscience can affirm our shared humanity. The enduring lesson is that honor is not defined by the orders we follow, but by the choices we make when no one is watching. If you found this story of unsung heroism as fascinating as we did, be sure to subscribe to WW2 Explained and join us as we continue to uncover the secret history of the war. Let us know in the comments which unsung hero we should feature next.